We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melting into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships and community manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm really excited for our next discussion with Sara Bokhari. She is the head of people and culture at Mursion. Sara, thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon. If you could share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and this could be anything, but what has recently brought you joy in life?
Well, so happy to be here. Thank you so much, Christina. As you mentioned, my name is Sara Bokhari. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm our head of people and culture here at Mursion. There are actually, despite all of the stress of coming out of a pandemic season, I think a lot of things that are bringing me joy. At work, I'd say it is just getting into stronger processes, back into rhythms of things. And in life, it's watching my little kiddos get ready to go back to school. So they're starting preschool and first grade this year.
That's really exciting and also a really good age as well to just be experiencing the world. I want to touch on your earlier kind of answer too, in terms of how do you think your personal journey has really led you to kind of lead the people and culture team at Mursion?
Mhm. So my background actually isn't formally in HR, although I've
Hmm.
done a lot of HR adjacent work. My first job out of college was as a middle school teacher. And I think in that, the idea of coaching people, helping them to learn, develop, grow, work towards goals, all of that are part of the skills that we do in people work all the time.
Hmm.
So my foundation, while not formally in HR, is in the same sort of skill set. And after my time in the classroom, I transitioned into being a management consultant, but in the K-12 education space. I've done a lot of work on things like talent development, performance management. So that's where I was talking about the HR adjacent work that I
Yeah.
did, but as a consultant rather than as leading my own team. When I came over to Mursion, I had the opportunity to build up our HR function from the ground up. So it's like a startup within a startup. And it's given me a lot of flexibility and autonomy in order to define what does strong people development look like? What does strong people support look like? And how do we do that in equitable ways? Because like I said, I was starting from scratch. So I was able to build up my team and build up those processes while keeping that equity mindset front of mind.
Yeah, and starting from scratch is not for everyone. It's definitely someone who enjoys fast-paced, building the ship while you're on it, and really, building out these processes, and of course, thinking about it in an equitable way, which I think is so important. And you were the first kind of full-time hire in this role. It's you kind of making these decisions, and I'm sure there are so many things you could tackle. How do you really prioritize just the different projects, especially early on as you are growing your team, and also just like the Mursion team in general?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I'll actually back up a little bit and share even more detail on how I landed into this role, because that's been the
Yeah.
foundation for how I make decisions. So I
Hmm.
actually joined Mursion on our client experience side. I was leading up our education work with all of our K-12 and higher education clients. And as a young startup, we still had a lot that we hadn't defined, including our company values. And I felt like it was so important that we really named those and made it transparent for all of our employees around what do we believe, what is part of our identity, and how does that shape how we approach our work. So I was able to take on a cross-functional project working with members of every corner of the organization to actually define what our values were. And
Hmm.
it was a months-long process, went through many iterations, heard a lot of different voices, but where we landed were on 4 core values that define who we are and how we operate. And in leading that work, my CEO saw that I really cared deeply about people and culture. And he
Yeah.
offered me this opportunity to step into this role to head up our first people and culture department. So it was through doing the work that I was able to step into it. And those values have really truly undergirded every decision that I've made in terms of what we prioritize, how we prioritize it. So one of the first projects that I looked at was how do we create equity for our employees and greater
Hmm.
transparency so that there's a consistent experience across their employee life cycle. We tackle that first in compensation. At this point now, a year later, we're rolling it out related to performance management. So
Hmm.
if you think about traditionally everything that an HR function covers, we're doing those things, we're building those pieces together and putting the blocks into place, but we're doing it with the backdrop of having our values be what pushes us in a particular direction.
I love that. I think it's really important to come back to a foundation or a framework for decision making and like sharing why. I think that's part of transparency, building trust with employees too, and compensation definitely one of the important ways to show, you're creating an equitable environment to work in. Can you tell us a little bit about how you kind of started digging into that project around compensation? And additionally, I know we talked about performance reviews and promotions and all of that good stuff to show that the company really, really values you and your career development.
Yeah, absolutely. So with compensation, as a young startup, basically what happened for us, and I think is pretty common, is that because we didn't have a centralized body that was talking about or pointing us towards how do we have, leveled bands, or what does it mean to be promoted, et cetera, all of our hiring managers or department leaders were making decisions based on their immediate teams, not necessarily in relation to other teams across the organization. So one of the first things we did is we said, let's look at what those decisions have meant. And we believe that most of them were strong decisions, but in some cases, we may have had outliers in terms of how we were compensating an employee, either below sort of target or above target. And we didn't want to take away earning from anybody, but we did want to level the playing field. So the first thing we did was actually set up those compensation bands, and we put a lot of research into it. So we met with every single department leader. I worked with a third-party consulting agency to look at benchmarks outside of the organization as well, and then made sure that we grounded that in our own philosophy of whether we were leading market, meeting market, or lagging market. And through that, we developed a comprehensive philosophy around how we compensate our employees. Then at the point where we got to actually making offers or looking at where people sat in the organization and re-leveling, we had a foundation or a framework that allowed us to make consistent decisions employee by employee. So that was that first step, was just putting some transparency. One of our values is called raising the bar. So it was raising the bar around how we compensate and evaluate our employees that was driving that particular action.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important in terms of what you mentioned for research and really looking to see where you are as a company. And then you're able to benchmark yourself to next year and the following year too, and just think about these and make really intentional, what it sounds like, decisions. And I'm sure with values and with the projects around compensation and just thinking about making the workplace more equitable, employees have feedback. How do you kind of measure employee feedback and really get that employee listening going to, make sure these programs are dynamic and you're really listening to kind of the feedback that folks have?
Well, prior to stepping into this role, we used the Gallup Q12 survey, and it was administered once a year, and it gave us a little bit of a read on just the employee pulse. Right? What was engagement like? But it didn't feel like enough to me. I wanted to get a more consistent read and not just one point in time. So one of the first actions that I did was to partner with Culture Amp. So we use their platform. I love their platform. It has so many features in it and so many different ways to engage and interact. And we did sort of a phased rollout of it. Before we got to actually using it for performance management, we wanted folks to feel really comfortable in the platform itself. So first we shared with all of our staff members, did you know this is a tool that you can use to give or request feedback? And we shared some examples of how you give valuable feedback. What are some frameworks for that, that sort of a thing. And just started getting people used to the idea of logging in and sending a quick note to a colleague to say, hey, this worked really well, or the impact of X was Y on me, and here's how I think we can have a stronger relationship. Once people got comfortable with that, our second phase was to get them to start publicly praising one another. So Culture App has a feature, it's called a public praise wall, and you can give shout outs to anybody in the organization and everybody can see it. So we have gotten into now this rhythm of everybody posting on a week, not everybody, but lots of people posting on a weekly basis, public praise shout outs. And then I amplify 2 or 3 of them every week in our People and Culture email update, which goes out to all of our employees. So it brings attention back, not just to the feedback and the praise, but also to Culture Amp as a tool that we want people to be deeply engaged with. Then, Yeah, so now that we've gotten through this, or like just getting comfortable in the platform itself,
Mhm.
we're able to quickly transition over to saying, okay, well, this is the platform that our performance management system is going to live in. And it is going to be a place where you get formal feedback, not just from your manager, but also from your peers, and where you can give formal feedback. So I didn't want to roll it all out as performance management is happening on Culture Amp, because it just felt like a lot. So I thought about, let's ease people into the idea of the tool and then get into performance management. So that's where we are today. We are launching our first performance management cycle, and it has 3 phases to it that are meant to help us sort of concretize this culture of continuous feedback. So the first is goal setting. We're asking all of our employees to set professional development goals and think about how are they contributing to the business while still growing their own career? What do they want their manager to be focused on and be giving them feedback on? The second is a pause. It happens mid-cycle. And the idea is company-wide, let's all take a step back and just really reflect on where are we in relation to our goals. Every employee has an opportunity to write a self-reflection. Managers can read them. And we're scheduling conversations around, well, what really came up in that? What are small changes we can make? How do we make sure that you're on track in your performance evaluation? And then the formal performance evaluation itself happens about 6 to 8 weeks later. So it shouldn't be a surprise at that point, right? Like you've already heard at least once, if not more frequently than that, how you're doing in relation to those goals. But then there's also that more formal collecting feedback from peers, direct reports, managers, et cetera, doing almost like a 360 along with self-reflections and a more formal write-up of here's your performance and here's a rating that's attached to it as well.
So it sounds like there's a lot of different ways to give and receive feedback, which I think is important and something that we believe in at AllVoices as well, in terms of just like a culture of feedback. I think one of the things that you brought up too was around reflection and really kind of self-awareness. And I think a lot of companies are doing this on a high level too, in terms of leadership and their strategies. And I definitely want to ask in terms of, creating an equitable workspace, what does Mursion's like diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy look like today? Has it changed kind of since you have been at the company, and what are your goals there?
Sure. So I'll start off by saying that anybody who tells you they have figured out their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, they may not be seeing the full picture. I think that it's really complicated, right? And so I'd say like we're progressing with our DE&I work, and I can point back to certain things that make me feel confident that we're trending in the right direction. And I can also point to things in the future and say we also need to be putting attention on XYZ.
Yeah.
So some of the things that to me are important to highlight are that I think true diversity, equity, and inclusion work doesn't happen in a training, doesn't happen in a public announcement. It actually happens in sort of boring policy, right? Like that's where equity truly happens. It's in creating systemic change that's sustainable, that allows everybody to fully thrive in a work environment. So I alluded to the compensation analysis we did. Like that to me is true equity work, right? Making sure that all employees of every gender, every racial and ethnic background, every type of ability are all compensated equitably. We also took a closer look at what's happening in our pipeline. So are we focused on that D side of diversity? Like, are we bringing candidates of diversity in the broadest sense of the word into a workplace and then supporting them once they're here? I was just reading recently, and I was fascinated by this research that said that when you have a woman or a person of color who's leading up your talent acquisition efforts, you're 104% more likely to create racially and ethnically diverse pipelines.
Yeah,
that's kind of incredible. Yeah. So I am super blessed to have an amazing director of talent strategy who's on my team, who leads up our talent acquisition work.
Incredible.
She's a Black woman, and she has an equity mindset, right? So she comes to the work and she asks those important questions around where in the pipeline are candidates of color dropping off? Why is that? How does how we write our job descriptions impacting whether or not women apply to this role or not? And so just having that lens and that awareness has made us, I think, have a stronger approach to bringing in really great, amazing talent while keeping that broad lens open. And since I joined, we now have 40% staff of color at
Incredible.
Mursion, which, in a tech company, I'm like, I feel proud about that. I want it to
Yeah.
keep on growing, right? Like we want to keep getting better and stronger with this. But I can look back at the data and say we've made progress here, in large part because how we've intentionally made sure that the systems we set up are not excluding anybody from being successful in the pipeline process.
I think that's really important and also interesting that it's baked in research as well. And I do want to highlight that 40% of your staff being POC is no small stat, especially in the industry. Can you talk a little bit about how you achieve that tangibly for folks who are like, I also want to kind of share an amazing stat over the next few years too?
Yeah, I think so. A few different things that we've done. One is thinking about what do our internal networks look like?
Hmm.
So are we creating referrals or creating opportunities for people to invite their friends to come apply at Mursion equitably across every employee? So that was one, is just tapping into our own internal networks and being mindful of who that really targets. Another thing, I think I mentioned this, is in how we actually write the job postings. So are the job postings themselves accessible? Are we showing who we are and making sure that if we have a hiring process, we're going slow enough so that we can create those pipelines that we want? Sometimes I think there's this tendency, especially in the startup world, to say, oh my gosh, we've got this gap here. Let's fill it. Quick, quick, quick. Let's fill it. I know a guy. Let me bring him in. And putting the brakes on and saying, that's great. That's great. You know a guy.
But
And yep, exactly. Let's take a little pause. Like, what would the
mhm,
pipeline look like if we were to wait one extra week? Or what can we do to make sure that our candidates of color, our female candidates, et cetera, are able to move through the pipeline a little bit more quickly, because we're focusing on really cultivating those sorts of relationships.
mhm.
My director of talent strategy also does an awful lot of work in sourcing, right? So looking for the types of candidates who we want to bring into the workplace, and not just waiting for them to come and find us. And I think those
Mhm.
sorts of efforts have really made a big difference.
I think that does really make a huge difference, especially again, bringing it back to being really intentional and genuine and authentic in your approach, and having that equity mindset is so important, especially in leadership roles and opening up these opportunities, writing inclusive job descriptions, making them more accessible to folks. And it is a lot of work. And as you were saying, like nobody has their diversity, equity, inclusion strategy figured out, but there are ways you can always improve. Are there any other kind of metrics that you look to measure the progress of or lack thereof of your DEI strategy? Well, also I want to caveat by saying like we don't want to ever over metricize, if that's a word, and say like, oh, we're checking the box, we're done with this goal, so we're not going to work on it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think data can speak volumes, and it can be motivating sometimes in a way that a qualitative conversation may not be. So I'll share a story of how that worked for us in one of our departments.
Great.
We had a hiring manager who was in a position of hiring a few new candidates into their team. And I looked across the team, and sort of visually, I could say like, oh, like there's not a lot of diversity in this team, both in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, but also in terms of age diversity. It was something
Right.
that was like, oh, like it seems like there's a particular profile that has gravitated towards this particular
Mm-hmm.
team. So rather than saying to this hiring manager, hey, like I really want you to look at a broader sort of candidate pool, all I did was pull the data of who is in this person's department in their team relative to all other teams across the company and across different data points. So gender, age, et cetera. And all I did was put the data there. And this person looked at it and they're like, oh, that is interesting.
Yeah.
Right. So like this person was able to see for themselves without me having to make a case that, you know what, we actually have an opportunity here to diversify our teams. So let's take
Mm-hmm.
advantage of it and not just kind of work on autopilot. So that's where I found data actually can do the talking for me rather than me having to do it. And looking at the makeups, not just of the pipelines coming in, but the current workforce has been important in that as well. And then one other thing that I like to think about, equity work is about creating access for more people
Mm-hmm.
as well. So we have a number of part-time employees here, and one of the things that was important to me is we have a benefit that they all have access to. It's a 401k. And as a part-time employee, that's a little bit rare to have access to a 401k match program.
Yeah.
But I also noticed that a lot of them weren't utilizing it. And so early on, I set up some lunch and learns and advertised them heavily to our part-time employee base, to the whole company, of course, but like took a little bit more intentionality to make sure that that was a group that heard about these lunch and learns, so that they knew that this is a benefit, that there's money on the table that they may have left that they can start contributing to. And so like that benefits usage to me is also another strong indicator of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, because it tells you who's taking advantage of the resources that you're putting in front of your workforce.
And those resources are really important as well, especially if they are available. It's that educational piece. And when we're talking about these strategies, I think it's important to note too, we're not talking about, departmental training, which is of course part of this piece, or just like events, programming. We're talking about different ways that diversity, equity, and inclusion can manifest in the organization and have a real impact on people's personal and professional lives. And it just speaks eons too in terms of people managers as well. I do want to get a little bit more into another project that you talked about too, in terms of values, which I think a lot of companies are either reevaluating or they're just honing in on and re-emphasizing too with their decision making. And wanted to talk to you about kind of one that is, like a lot of tech companies often say, like, you have to fail fast and then you can like innovate and you can always just, come to me with your mistakes. But that means something different for everyone. For example, if candor is one of your core values, that there's a difference of how that manifests, or how how you see an example of that in the workplace, as opposed to just like a white person versus a BIPOC person, demonstrate and what they're comfortable kind of doing in the workplace. Can you talk about how you have kind of seen these different perspectives, like building these values functionally? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right that values can sort of be a little lofty at times, right?
Yeah.
So when I look at our values, I'll look at them and I'll say, yeah, that is who we are. And they're aspirational. It's not what we do perfectly. It's who we want to be and what we believe is important as an organization. But it doesn't tell you anything about how you should act. So what we did when we built out our performance competencies was to define 5 performance competencies that were derived from each of our company values.
Okay.
So we believe that every company value informs every performance competency, but you may have a leading value in one performance competency relative to another. So for instance, we have one about adaptability. So that's the performance competency. And when you look at our values, values of empathy and curiosity may be leading in this particular performance competency. The second thing we did after defining the performance competencies that we believe are the sorts of skills you should demonstrate in order to show effectiveness is to then translate those over into behaviors. So sometimes people talk about performance competencies having indicators, and that indicator language to me can sometimes still be a little bit nebulous, right? It's sort of like a little bit lofty still. But when we shifted to say, like, what are the behaviors? It felt a lot more concrete. And so in thinking about how do we ensure that performance, how we judge performance, how we give feedback is equitable across the board, we just have to get really concrete and transparent around what kinds of actions and behaviors would we see versus not see, and then share that broadly with our employees. And I think that's where language like candor or high performance, et cetera, can feel a little bit blurry unless you take that extra step to really define, like, what do we mean by candor here?
Exactly.
So that was something that I feel like has got I don't know if it's the long way, it's steps in the right direction to making what performance looks like more transparent.
Yeah, and I think that's part of transparent communication as well, and really defining all of the maybe buzzwords that we hear as well, and also, taking note that maybe these values are aspirational. Again, this is not something that we're perfect at, but we're actively seeking to do so and meeting employees where they are as well. I know that you kind of mentioned throughout your journey too that your CEO has been really supportive of your journey and taking on all of these projects, and the experience that you have too. How has he really shown up for you, whether you've asked him to or you haven't? How has he really been supportive?
in so many ways. So I feel really, really lucky. One, to have gotten a manager who saw potential in me, even when I
Mhm.
wasn't in this role yet, and asked the question of, like, what do you want to do? He actually asked me, like, would you like to write your own job description? When I approached him and said, like, I'm
That's
not
awesome.
sure I really want to do client engagement work. Yeah.
Yeah.
And just getting that encouragement and being told, like, oh, you can actually define what it is you want to do here. And then being given the opportunity to not only define it, but to step into it, like that's huge, right? That shows me that my manager, my CEO has a lot of confidence, not just in my potential, but also in my skill.
Mhm.
Um, I've also appreciated how accessible he's made himself. I know how busy he is. I can see his calendar and it is
Yeah.
wildly full. And yet he makes time for me every single week. And if I am struggling with something, he makes additional time and never has made me feel like I'm asking for more than what's reasonable in any way.
Mhm.
So those are some ways where I've been shown that he's invested in me. And a few other things too. His approach to feedback is when you give people feedback, be direct about it, be clear about it, and then you forget about it. But you don't have to
Mhm.
harp on that piece of feedback of, well, sorry, you really struggled with this thing. It's like, I told you the
Yeah.
thing, you got it. Okay, let's move on. And it's made it feel like a healthy relationship where I'm like, okay, I want to hear the ways that I can improve. I'm also not going to allow those to make me continue to stumble and just be ruminating on them constantly and then have that impact my ability to be a consistent performer. Um, so those were some of the ways where I found him to be terribly supportive in so many ways, and also just like giving me a lot of autonomy and a lot of trust, and helping me figure out along the way, like if I make a decision, sort of poking holes in it and saying, is this the right decision? How are you thinking about this? Have you thought about that? But then letting me make the decision at the end of the day.
Yeah. I think autonomy, trust, really important. And it sounds like he invested a lot of time in you too, saw your potential and really kind of carved a path for you too. And I think part of building trust really with anyone is just giving that feedback that is like great feedback, constructive and everything kind of in between. And when you have that trust, you're less likely to take it more personally and you okay, you hear it and then you move on and you give that feedback as well. You're comfortable doing that. And I imagine kind of with this one-on-one relationship, it manifests in the organization as well through other people managers and just the company culture. How have you seen the culture of employee trust and listening really manifesting at Mursion?
Mhm. Such a good question. I think that because we're a young startup, it's still gelling in a lot of different places. But one
Yeah.
of the behaviors that I've noted from our newer executive leadership that's come into immersion over the last year or so is that all of them have started with a listening tour. And that speaks volumes, right? Like, yes, they're coming in with a ton of talent, and we hired them because we believe that they have a lot to contribute to the organization.
Mhm.
But just the fact that they're saying, like, tell me a little bit more about your experience, or how many people can I talk to in my first week, just to one, make that initial connection with, and then two, understand the nuance of what the work looks like day to day.
Yeah.
So that's one behavior that I've noticed has felt very valuable and opens up that accountability and transparency. It's something that I've also incorporated just into my monthly processes. So I used to do this a lot more often. I was doing it weekly, of setting up time with employees in different parts of the organization. I've
Yeah.
gotten down to monthly now because it takes a lot of time, but it's valuable, right? It's just to set up listening tours and to think about, like, who have I not heard from across the
Yeah.
organization, or if I'm working on XYZ project, who's something I can get some additional feedback from on this, and just like have that open dialogue happening. Especially as a dispersed workforce, it's so easy to feel disconnected. But if you have a special project or you have an opportunity to just pause and connect on something that's maybe outside of your own department or outside of like the day-to-day problem that you're trying to solve, I think it creates more opportunities to kind of see that humanness in each other and feel more connected.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. Also, I think a common misconception around feedback, or if you're not hearing from someone or a group of people, whether it's a department or just like when people join too, was, like it's not that everything is going well. You have to directly ask for the feedback and just like have that conversation, even if you don't know what the answer is going to be. I guess looking ahead with your experience, I know we talked about a lot of kind of things that you're building out at Immersion, but just in your experiences there, something that really like people and culture leaders and companies really need to be aware of in order to be successful in the future and create this like more equitable workplace?
Mhm. Oh gosh, so many things. Well, one thing that comes to mind actually, when you're in a high growth startup, change is the norm, and change can be really uncomfortable. But if you as a leader can create moments of consistency for your staff members, it gives them something to anchor around and know that the expectation is clear. This sounds like a very minor, silly example, but I send out a weekly people and culture update every Friday at 8 a.m. Central. I write it the week before. I set it on auto send on Thursday night. So it goes out and hits everybody's inboxes at 8 a.m. Central. And people now know that that's coming. And that's where we put our shout outs. It's where benefits updates are. There's always a recommended resource around just work culture. It's very simple. It's nothing very fancy, but it's consistent. And I've gotten pretty great feedback from across the whole organization that people like that they know they can expect it. They know that they can wait till the end of the week to get an update on what's happening across the org. And that it's also a place where they can feel connected to the other employees, because we sometimes add pictures of people or we'll give little bio updates and that kind of a thing. So I think that consistency piece is one big thing that I would encourage. Like if you can find even tiny, tiny ways to be consistent with something, just grab onto that, because it creates maybe psychological safety is like maybe too large of a term for it, but it creates, I think, a sense of reliability that's often needed in a quickly changing environment. And then the
I
other
think
thing is, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I don't think it's a too big of a word to use, psychological safety. I think that's something that we really believe in at All Voices, and it's these repeatable, actionable, consistent ways that you demonstrate that you show up for people, that you create that psychological safety. So I was just gonna plus one that, but you continue.
I will take that plus one. And the other thing that for myself is I found that it has been helpful as a leader to know when I'm getting pushed out of my comfort zone, like what's happening to me physically, emotionally, psychologically, so that I can stop myself from making decisions when I'm in that sort of state. I was joking with somebody just a couple weeks ago saying, like, I know that when I'm a little more snappy with my kids, I'm really stressed out. But if I can get off work and like, and we're playing and rolling around on the ground and like doing all the fun things, it's less likely that, I am stressed out at work. So it's a signal for me that I need to maybe pause and say, like, what's happening that I need to be a little bit more mindful of.
Yeah, I think that's really important too. Again, being kind of having that self awareness and doing that internal check to say, okay, do I feel burned out? I mean, you're working on so many different projects as well, and showing up for people and showing up for yourself also counts. I know I asked a bunch of questions about kind of your personal journey and version strategy, and also where you're seeing kind of the future. How do you, even though nobody has a crystal ball, is there anything kind of that I didn't ask that you want to share with our audience, or one or two key takeaways that you hope folks bring with them after they listen to our episode?
I One thing that I've been thinking a lot about is being in a people function is hard. It's
Yeah.
emotionally taxing, and it's also technically taxing, right? Like there's just a lot that you need to know in terms of HR law and benefits policies. And it means that HR professionals have to just hold on to a lot. And there often are not a lot of outlets that are appropriate at work to kind of let out some of that emotion or let out some of that steam.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to think about like, what does that mean for me as a leader? Like, where do I need to find those outlets for myself? But how do I support other people leaders in the same work? So folks on my team, like, where am I giving them opportunities to just like take a step back and say, like, let's take 3 minutes to vent at the top of a
Mhm.
call, or like that sounds really, really hard. Let's put into paper what the solutions are that we're going to work on so it doesn't feel hard a couple of weeks from now. Um, and I think like that would be the one other thing that I would just leave is like this work is so difficult. So as people, professionals, I think the more we can find opportunities to support each other in it, the stronger our work can end up being. And we also need to be taking care of ourselves in that so that we can show up and be our best selves for everybody else in the company.
Yes, absolutely. I think of the analogy of when you're on an airplane and you're instructed to put on your face mask or just like the air first before you help someone else, and just make sure you recharge your battery so you are showing up to work and just bringing your best self as well. So I think that is a really important point to make in the conversation, especially at a time where a lot of folks are looking to folks or leaders and just teams to fix everything and anything. It's important to recognize also that one's mental health is important. Sara, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. It was really great to speak with you, and I'm excited to stay connected in the future.
Yeah, same here. Thank you so much. Loved having this conversation with you. And I hope that we do stay connected.
Absolutely. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, All Voices believes in the empowerment of everyone at the company to provide feedback, and we know it's a requirement for the organization to succeed. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thanks.